Welcome to the video legal podcast where we will address questions of and answers to layman's language. And the topic for tonight is congressional lobbying. Welcome, I'm John Deary, and we are delighted that you are here watching our podcast, and it'll be a very, very interesting one tonight. From the law firm of Denton's, located in Washington, D.C., I am so delighted to introduce a person who is not only a great personal friend, but someone that has a remarkable background that can shed so much good light on our congressional lobbying, and that's former Congressman Joe Crowley. Joe, so delighted that you're here.
It's great to be with you, John, as always, and I have great fond memories of our earlier life together up in the Albany days. So, and always maintaining the relationships has been wonderful for me. So.
You know, it's remarkable, Joe, that you have 32 years being in the legislative field, 12 years in Albany in the New York State Assembly,
right,
and 20 years in the United States Congress.
Yeah.
Just thinking initially with regard to that legislative experience and maybe differentiating between what you did on the state side and what you did on the United States congressional side.
Sure.
What's your sense in terms of your experience?
I think in many respects that the New York State Assembly and the New York State Legislature in particular are kind of like the AAA of the minor leagues. The way I think about it, if you think of Congress as the major leagues, right?
Yes,
maybe a misnomer these days in people's opinions. But I think if you look back on it, California, New York, to some degree like Florida, states where people looked to in terms of mimicking legislation. So it was quite often something that New York was doing took on a more national perspective anyway. And so I think it really prepared me when I went down to Washington at 36 years of age. I came with a wealth of knowledge of how things kind of operate, maybe on a smaller scale, but fairly large when it comes to New York up in Albany. And I think I had that background. And I noticed a number of my colleagues who were coming in had similar backgrounds. And people come from all walks of life in Washington. Some are doctors, some are attorneys, some are engineers, some are different backgrounds. And many of them had some form of legislative background, or mayors, or maybe even former governors, for instance.
The interesting aspect is the fact that you have over 3 decades of being a legislator. What's your perspective with regard to that role as it relates to the general lobbying field? Mm-hmm. You, I would imagine, probably sat across and heard lobbyists thousands of times making approaches to you. How do you reflect on your position as a legislator?
Yeah, I think I look at it in kind of 3 kind of buckets. You had advocates, you had stakeholders, and then you had lobbyists. And I think of advocates as people who were coming because they work for not-for-profits, or maybe constituents who had an issue, a legislative concern, or an issue they want to bring to my attention. I look at stakeholders as people who maybe worked for a company or worked for an entity that came to talk to me about why I should consider their position on a bill, not necessarily being paid to be there. They work for the company, but they're not being paid as lobbyists to come in and see. And then, the hiring of an actual lobbyist, someone that a company or a not-for-profit or any entity, like the Catholic Charities, for instance, has lobbyists in both Albany and in Washington. And they're paid consultants who give advice as to how to approach this, maybe which legislators are the ones you need to be making contact with, and giving them that advice in terms of process and when is the right time to approach, what is the right time to act, and then making that connection happen. I think that's what the role of a modern lobbyist is today.
Before we get to the lobbying work that you're doing, I want to stay on because I think you bring a unique perspective of having been both a legislator and also now in the lobbying field. Would you say that what are the major things that you think you may have learned by being as a legislator and listening to people approach you?
Well, I think that it's important in the creation of legislation and of law is to listen to all sides as best you can and to listen to experts in that particular field. I think one thing about a member of Congress is that you're dealing maybe with 50 different issues a day. And that's, what's happening in your district in terms of your constituency, your district offices, what's happening in your own office that you're running in Washington, as well as what's happening within the Democratic caucus of the Republican conference, depending on the party you belong to, navigating the leadership of the party you belong to as well in terms of how do you get something you're excited about or interested in to the next level, committee chairs, committee staff, etc., things of that nature. So I think from a lobbying perspective, I think my staff look to them as experts in the field as one aspect of it, not in totality. But I think in terms of providing resources and information, when you're putting together your thoughts and ideas and the construct of legislation, that it's an important aspect, not an exclusive aspect, not something you solely look at, but you take that all into consideration.
When you were in the legislature, let's say down in Congress, and you had a particular bill that you felt ultimately you would have to make a decision on, and let's say that you were leaning towards X, did you listen to lobbyists that were coming to you from Y? In other words, with a different point of view, even
Sure.
though you were aiming to think in this direction?
Sure. I mean, that happened quite often, actually. And on some occasions, I may have taken that into consideration and said, well, yeah, it's a good point you make, type of thing. And then, at those points, it's typically already at an advanced stage. And it's really more about trying to provide maybe perspective for other colleagues. And when you're presenting your position on that is that you're trying to convince other colleagues, especially the sponsors of the legislation. Maybe it may not be my legislation, maybe someone else's. And therefore you're trying to convince the other colleagues within the conference or the caucus to see things in your way. And it may be that something that a lobbyist or someone else, doesn't necessarily have to be a lobbyist, but they certainly could be an influential and an important, have some influence and important aspect of that.
Again, let's talk about you being a legislator.
Mm-hmm.
What is your evaluation as you reflect back over the, I say, 1,000 probably of different approaches that you've gotten from lobbyists? So putting you in the legislator role, what is your evaluation of the quality of lobbyists?
I think that lobbyists, generally speaking, have gotten a pretty bad shtick throughout the years. I think blame for a lot of what's wrong, and I think when done properly and done legally and done above the board, it's perfectly fine. I think that when you can bring a point of view, and even if you're paid to do that, if it's something you believe in, and be able to bring that point of view to a legislator and maybe have an impact on the development of legislation, that's important. I think there have been certainly examples in the past where lobbyists have done things they shouldn't have done. And I think what we've seen, what happens as a result of that is stronger laws are put in place for to make sure that there is it's opaque and that people can you can see exactly what's happening in terms of registration, how much they're being paid for that purpose. So I think the public light, I think that's a bleach, and it's good. I think that is exposed. So I think we've come a long way in terms of where we were, even 1 or 2 decades ago in terms of lobbying. That's why I say the more modern lobbyist.
You had, as I said, 32 years. That's a heck of a long time to be in the legislature. My question is, did you feel, or do you feel, that in your 31st or 32nd year, as compared to your initial years in New York State in the Assembly, do you have any sense as to the difference in being a legislator and the type of issues you're dealing with?
I think the one big difference is the eyeballs that are on you when you're in Congress are a bit different than when you're in the state legislature. That can vary from district to district, I think. When I was elected, I was 24. When I was elected to the state assembly, I was still relatively young. Looking back, I was aware, but I always think when I went to Congress and I look back to my legislative days in New York, I said, man, if I was there now, the things I know now, what I would have done, type of thing. And I think that's also the same approach I had maybe to lobbyists. And the rules were very different back in those days. Today you can't buy a cup of coffee for a member of Congress. Back then, or a member of the state legislature. It was different back then. But I always felt it was benign. I never felt as though it was anything egregious going on. Or that was my experience. I think others maybe felt pressured, but I never felt like I was, giving anything away or giving anything up because someone bought me a lunch or a dinner or something like that. That just may have been me. I think in some respects, we're never going back to those days again. But in many respects, in those old days, lobbyists actually brought both sides of the aisle together. I barely could rub two nickels when I came to the state legislature. It was a big opportunity. So going out, I wasn't buying dinner for anyone, but it was an opportunity to bring Democrats, Republicans together. You probably remember your own experience back then. It really was an opportunity to get to know people on the other side of the aisle. And I think a lot of that's been taken away. Again, we're not going back to those days, and we'll have to find other ways to bring people together. But that's one aspect of the old lobbying that I think was effective.
Did you think from the 20 years, and that's a long time, and a lot of meetings and a lot of work, did you feel that the much of a difference between the first year in Congress and when you left?
Oh, sure. I mean,
what was it?
I think that first of all, the familiarity of the people. You get to know people. Yeah. I think the familiarity of my staff with individuals that had come in. That people develop a reputation as well, and I think what's important is trust. Being able to know when that person says something that you can believe it, because that's an important aspect of it. I think that when I was, certainly as a more junior member, I wasn't given the focus, necessarily the attention that I was given as a more senior member and a part of the House leadership. So where I think my influence was greater during the latter years of my service in the House, more so than when people just getting to know me, as a young 36-year-old man. Again, coming out of New York, which was, important. If you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere, so to speak. So I think that does open up eyeballs, but it takes time. And I think, and even for your staff turnover, and they're young. And they continue to be young, which is good, I think, as well. But always reintroducing and learning. At some point, I may know more about that person coming in than they did. So
in the United States Congress, what is the significance of what state you're from? For example, you were from New York State. Mm-hmm. One has to assume that New York State has a certain amount of prestige, maybe more than a number of other states or whatever. Yeah. What is the sense of that as to where you're from?
Coming from New York initially was much more prestigious in many respects because we had so many more seats. And throughout the last 3 decades, we've lost a considerable number of seats, over a dozen. And at one time, New York was the largest delegation to the House of Representatives. So it really did have a greater impact in terms of the number of members who came from the state. For instance, California, Texas, Florida have really grown tremendously. The Sun Belt states have grown tremendously. The northern states have lost, and New York is not an exception there. We've lost members of the Congress to other states as well. And that has certainly had an impact. But I still think there's a cachet, having come from New York. I'd
like to think so.
Yeah, I think it rubs both ways. Yeah. There's a lot of, anti-New York feeling out there as well.
Why? Why would that be?
I think that it's always been, even though you and I come out of a different, both similar ways, a different maybe view of New York. It's 2 Irish Catholic boys, one from the Bronx, one from Queens. Maybe a little different than how the perception of overall New York is, as being this bastion of extreme liberalism, for instance, And, much of that going back to the foundation of New York itself as a Dutch colony that really persisted even throughout the British days and the colonial days and to the city we are today that we can look back to. But I also think there's a good bit of respect for New York as well. And, 9/11 had a major impact on that. The events of Sandy, we have always been there for other states when they need help, whether it's hurricanes or tornadoes or whatever that may be, or wildfires. I think the country did rally to a fairly well, especially after 9/11, to focus and help New York as best they could.
So we are focused on looking at your background on the legislative side of it, and quite a remarkable one, and you've accomplished an enormous amount over that years that I'm familiar with, but it's the reality. Let's just jump to being the lobbyist now.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see a perspective of your initial view with regard to being a lobbyist as opposed to somebody that's receiving a lobbyist proposal. You're now the lobbyist making the proposal.
Well, typically, and I think lobbyist itself is a much broader range than actually going down in shoe leather up to Capitol Hill and walking into offices. It can range from doing that, which is certainly I'm not shy of from doing, but it also goes to giving counsel, giving advice, and that's paid advice as well. Our law firm, Denton's, is one of the largest law firms in the country, actually in the world. We're in over 50 different countries around the world. And we have one of the smallest public policy shops in Washington, D.C. We're about 40. So it's almost like having a boutique public policy shop, lobbying shop in a major law firm. So we have all those resources as well to kind of to tie into. And it could be that a client of ours at the firm, they may have questions about what's happening in Washington. They may not want me to take direct action or actually do anything about it, but they want to hear more, learn more about what's happening in Washington and why maybe they should be more engaged. It could be political. They could be someone running for office in their area and they want to know my thoughts on the chances of them winning and whether or not it's something they should get behind. And ultimately can lead to actual engagement, through contract, to hire us, to work on the issues they care about.
There's something with regard to lobbyists, as you say, there's a little bit of a sort of mystique relative to it. But what is the process of registering to be a lobbyist? How does that work?
Well, whenever you are actually contracted and actually make more than one contact with a member of the House or the Senate, you have to register with the federal government. And be registered as a lobbyist. And then it's all open to public disclosure. And it's widely looked at. So this is both from a competitive standpoint, people want to know in the other firms who's got what, who's doing what, but also from a public interest standpoint. The media is very much about, for lack of a better word, exposing, but bringing light to who is actually engaged and who's being hired for whose position.
Is there a process for registering? Is there a form? That
there is a form. I don't know the name of it at the top of my head. My firm actually does that for us.
Yes.
And most law firms, being very conservative and due diligent, make sure that that is all done properly. In fact, I don't have to sign at that point. It's all done by the firm itself, and they register for us.
Give us a sense as to your experience. How much somebody says you would be a very significant lobbyist, given again your legislative background and so forth. So I guess my question is, what is it like, and how often are you, in fact, doing lobbying one-on-one with members of Congress?
It depends really on the client. So I have a partner of mine, a former Republican congressman from California, Jeff Denham. He lost his general election the year that I lost my primary back in 2018. We were friends in the House. We worked on immigration reform together, and we had quite a good relationship then, and we've only become better and closer friends since then. Jeff has relations with the administration. He has certainly relations with the majority in the House and the Senate. I'm right now in the minority, both the House and the Senate, and don't control the White House in terms of our party. So it has an impact in terms of my being effective in terms of the majorities. But there are still roles to play for the minority in both the House and the Senate. And so, we both work together in that vein. If he needs help, I help him, and if I need help, he helps me, so to speak.
Do you basically, is it something that, look, you're a well-known Democrat. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that you basically do lobbying with Democrats?
Primarily, that's the case.
It is.
In the Trump 1 presidency, there were some members of his cabinet or within his shop that I did know, and was able to approach, probably without the knowledge of the president at that time. I can't say I'm a favorite of the president's. I think that's much different in this second administration. Although I know Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, I know Bob Kennedy, I don't really wouldn't have any contact with them at this point.
What is your sort of receptiveness to doing lobbying with guys that you were sitting on that other side of the desk for such a long time? What's your perspective of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think one is the personal relationships are always there, and the friendships. I think one of the things that I had worked on, was to be respected, certainly in my own party, but also on the other side of the aisle. And I think that I accomplished that. Even when I left Congress in 2018, I had sincere, thanks from the other side of the aisle as well for my years of service.
Well, I think that goes just, let me say, knowing you as long and as well as I do, the truth of the matter is, you'd be very hard-pressed to find a person that is more likable than you are. So if you're a likable person, Democrats or Republicans, I don't think matters what what that is.
Well, I think for some people, going back and seeing your former colleagues in a different way, it can be difficult. But for me, I had worked my 20 years up to become a member of the House leadership. I got to know these people very, very well. And so in many respects, it's an opportunity for us to see each other again and rekindle some of those relationships. And at the same time, have the opportunity to either afford myself the opportunity to talk about an issue, or have my client come in and have the opportunity to speak and maybe take off, if there is some antithesis there, to kind of take some of that away so we can have an open discussion about something.
Joe, when you talk about leadership, I think it is worth noting that at the time in the 16, 17, 18 year time period in there, that you were very being supported as a notion of being the Speaker of the United States Congress.
Yep.
So that's pretty interesting to reflect the stature in which you had at that point.
Yeah.
And
well, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, well, it's very true. When you're speaking to members, what is your sense? And you've got such experience. This is really matching the lobbying to your legislative experience. What do you think a majority of the members that you're lobbying, how much freedom might they have in terms of making decisions predicated upon the advocacy you make?
It's a good question. I think that there are all kinds of pressures that come to bear. There's the bear of House leadership. There's the pressure of the media. Certainly, and maybe foremost, is your constituency. Where are they at? I think that something you ought to earn over time from your constituency is to have their faith that you'll do what you think is in the best interest of them, and that you may be exposed to information that they may not be. And that's not to say that this is not a dumbing down of anyone. I mean, it's just that, there's only so many hours in a day you can communicate back and forth. And I think we try our best to do that, whether it's through town halls or teletown halls or, just being present in a district, being reachable. And that was something that was always important to me. It was back in my district, when I was back in district, that I had regular meetings in my office with my constituency primarily to hear their thoughts on what I was doing, what I should be doing. And I think most members approach it that way. So there are different pressures that are brought to bear. Getting reelected is probably the most important one. I think that's for them, and that's where the constituency comes in. All the money aside, all the publicity aside, it comes down to, does your constituency support you or not at that given time? And so, but I think people are looking for information when they're weighing something so heavy. Well, I'll give you an example, like the Affordable Care Act, for instance. And we held town hall meetings in 2009, and open air meetings, and just try to get as much information. And look, there are folks didn't like what we were doing. We had to hear that as well. And that was important for us to bring back, say, hey, look, not everybody's all that thrilled about this, even in New York City. So I think those are the things you do as a member, an effective member, I think. And I think it's reflective in you getting reelected. That's obviously, how are you judged as whether you got reelected or not.
So tonight's topic, as we're discussing on the podcast, is congressional lobbying. And I'm interested, are there any significant lobbying rule changes of more recent times as contrasted to the
Well,
beginning?
there really haven't been changes to the law of recent time. There were some changes during the Pelosi era in our first term as Speaker. I really can't think of too many. And that one basically was that it limited members when they left Congress to a year where they could not lobby their former colleagues. Nothing has changed in that sense yet. It gives a year of time off to kind of, I guess. I don't know necessarily what effect it has at this point. In the Senate, it's 2 years. But there really hasn't been any changes in the law. I think there have been some changes in terms of the envelopes have been pushed primarily by the administration in terms of what is and what isn't acceptable. But
Such as?
Well, I think in terms of the fact that the president can start a Bitcoin company and have no ethical or legal action taken against him for doing so to creating wealth for himself through his offices or his family creating wealth. So I think that's an example of something. I think members have been much more resistant to that because we have an ethics committee, we have an outside ethics entity that can bring complaint. I mean, the one thing about me was that I never wanted to do anything that would ever disgrace my family name. And I think that was more important to me. That was just very ingrained in me. But it really is about the appearance, not even whether you actually do something wrong, that you give an appearance that maybe you did something wrong. That in of itself can be grounds for an ethics violation. And so I think the rules for members of the House and Senate are much tighter than it is for the presidency even, and certainly for the Supreme Court, which we've seen as well throughout the years.
We don't have to get into specific details of an entity that you may be lobbying on behalf of, but it might be of interest to our listeners, maybe the general kind of categories of issues that you're lobbying.
Sure. We from financial services entities to big tech to transportation, air and rail, all forms of transportation. Jeff Denham and much revolves around your committee assignment work when you were in the House. Jeff was a member of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee as well as Agricultural Committee. He was this is Jeff Denham, my partner.
Yes.
He was a big pecan grower in California, believe it or not, and not like a kid from Woodside, Queens. For me, I was on Ways and Means and on Foreign Affairs. I've been approached by foreign governments. I haven't taken any foreign governments because there are stricter registration requirements, including with the State Department, that I'd have to really believe in the work that I'm doing in order to take on those responsibilities, I think.
That's a very interesting thing because it could open up an avenue for business for you as a lobbyist. At the same time, it sounds like there are some challenging restrictions.
I think there are, maybe rightly so, because you're an American, you're representing a foreign country. You don't have all the information. That they're not going to give you all the information. So there's a State Department, there's a CIA, there's the FBI that is involved as well. So it makes it a much more challenging, and I think it's a more, like a better term, more boutique kind of field to be in. But having said that, tax, for instance, I was on the tax running committee, Medicare, Social Security, all those kinds of issues were the issues that came before me. Trade, so the tariff issue has been something that our firm has been engaged in very, very much so. And all trade, we have the USMCA negotiations coming up, the U.S.-Canadian-Mexico agreement, and we know how much interest there is in this issue, given the president's positioning in terms of trade and tariffs.
Are you enjoying being a lobbyist?
I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss being in Congress or being a legislator. There was something about the thrill of that,
Yes.
and I think I've said to you, when I flew into Washington, every time I saw the White House or I'd see the Capitol building, for instance, I work there. That's where I work. It's kind of cool.
Yep.
And not to be too nostalgic or even childlike about it, but it was kind of a thrill. It was a great thrill. So I do miss that. I miss my colleagues, many of my colleagues, in terms of the daily basis, the give and take, and the back and forth. There's a lot of change in Congress, though. A lot of my former colleagues are now retired as well. So that's one thing is misnomer about Congress as well, that it never changes. I mean, Congress just changed an awful lot, more than 10 to 15% every 2 years, if not greater, maybe 25% at times.
Well, there's an awful lot. As a matter of fact, I just saw a report about the increased number of members that are leaving, both Republican and Democratic.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the real question is, what's your sense about the caliber of members today as compared to your early years 20 years ago?
When I was there early on, we had some incredible names. You had Henry Waxman. You had certainly Nancy. I'm calling from the Dem side. Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, someone who are still there, but certainly their years in terms of Congress are waning at this point. You had such powerhouses that, in many respects, the folks maybe have taken up, maybe have a different approach to it, and I think that the speaker's position or the leadership has curtailed, in many respects, some of that authority. So a Richie Neal doesn't have as much authority maybe within his committee that he'd like in terms of members of the past. And that may be a good thing. I don't know. It depends on your perspective. But certainly a Frank Pallone doesn't. Maybe they haven't have the same authority that others in the past may have had in the chairmanship of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And so that may be the difference too. We're also coming out of a different age. I mean, I served with some members who fought in World War II and the Korean War, and those years are coming to an end now too,
Sure.
in terms of their service. But there are still some remarkable people on both sides of the aisle who serve in the House of Representatives. Very talented people.
It's very interesting because we're talking about New York State. Not only do you have your two top legislative leaders, Senator Schumer and Congressman Jeffries, when you really think, not only are they from the same state, not only are from the same city, they're from the same borough.
Yeah.
It's really a remarkable thing. And I really wonder, and I've been curious as to whether there's any kind of negative feeling of, oh my God, not only are they two very experienced, qualified people, but they are from the same borough.
Yeah, and I think when I was looking at that myself, that was raised in terms of my potential of being the leader or maybe potentially being the speaker. I think Hakeem has kind of negated a lot of that. His style is different than Chuck's, even though they're from the same borough.
Yeah.
John, you know very well, you could be in Riverdale or you could be in the South Bronx.
Sure.
And still in the Bronx, but they're two completely different neighborhoods.
Sure.
And so I think that's the same for Brooklyn, certainly for certain parts of Queens as well. But I think you have to keep in mind that when being elected to those positions, where you come from matters. Whether we have, and I think there's a balance within the leadership. You look at Catherine Clark, who's from Massachusetts, Pete Aguilar is from California. There is a spreading out of the map in terms of involvement in leadership. But I think it has more to do with Hakeem's talents and his personality, and that his colleagues, his constituency like him. And they have faith in him. So I think that's what it's really more reflective of. It's the same thing with Chuck. Again, it's a much smaller body, less than 50 people decide who the minority leader of the Senate is. But once you're in, it's also hard to get out. So
it's what?
Once you're in, it's more difficult to get out, or to be expunged. But, I always say that, and this has no relation to Chuck or anyone else, that graveyards are filled with indispensable people, and that the notion or idea that you're the only person who can do these things is really crazy. But many members think that they're the only person who can do this.
Yes.
And I think sometimes that's a little taken to the end.
Well, Joe, you have really an amazing background on the legislative side and now on the lobbying side. You're an incredibly, as I mentioned before, likable person. And so those are personality traits that will be nothing but successful for you in going forward.
Well, Johnny D,
You're
I learned
not
from the
likely-
best. I learned from the best.
You're
Johnny
likely,
D.
you're likely not going to be on the congressional side of it, but I think your expansiveness on the lobbying side is very exciting, and you've really shared that and given us a good feeling. And thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you, Johnny.
What a pleasure.
Love you.